Okay, board types. So I have three different boards here. I have two hard boards and an inflatable. We're going to talk about hull types, shapes of the hulls, the intent of why those different types of hull types, or why those different hull types. We're going to talk about different features of them, like rocker, roundedness, pointiness. We're going to talk about volume of the board, which relates to carrying capacity. And we're going to talk about inflatables. So let's jump in with hull types. There are two primary types of hulls as the airplane goes over. Two primary types of hulls. There is planing hull and there is displacement hull. This board here is a planing hull. Planing hulls look like surfboards. That's our heritage. That's where that's where stand-up paddling came from, Hawaii. It was variations on surfing. It started as SUP surfing. Surfers were adapting using a paddle. And then from there, the boards got bigger and bigger so that we could stand on them doing different sports like touring, rivers, or just general recreation. So the planing hull is how it kind of started, because it was literally a stretched out surfboard. Why it's called planing is how surfboards work is they're always more stable when they're moving, and a surfboard, the faster it's going, it's not dragging through the water, it's actually coming up on the surface of the water and planing over top, and that's how they go so fast. So this board is designed to come up to planing. To get it planing is going to be a lot more work than we could possibly paddle, but the intent of the original design is there, so we call it planing board. On a planing board, similar to that surfboard, any paddleboard is always more maneuverable and more stable when it's moving. So that applies to all three of these boards here. So back to the planing board. Characteristics of the planing board: rounded on the front. Quite often tail is rounded or a little bit pinched in like this one here. Usually wider in the center. And they have rocker. But let's start with rounded at the front. Rounded at the front means it's not going to dig into the waves. It can move and maneuver easily. This board is very maneuverable and again more stable when it's moving. Wider in the center. So Kahuna is actually a brand designed out of Whistler. All of these boards have been made overseas, but Kahuna, Level 6 are Canadian brands. Thurso, I believe, is not. Kahuna designs their boards with accentuated rocker and wider in the middle. So this board here, the sizing on it is 10.3 inches long and about 33.5 across the middle, which is fairly wide for a paddleboard. That extra width is always going to be where the feet go, around the handle, so that the board is gaining extra stability. So these boards in general are wider, which makes them stable. Narrower at the back gives a little bit more maneuverability, but because it's not super narrow, similar to the board over there, we still gain some stability from this shaping of the tail. So planing boards, kind of a general purpose board. It's where the sport originated. They're generally rounded at the front and a little bit narrower at the tail. They always have rocker on them. The amount of rocker is going to vary depending on manufacturer. And rocker is, you see how this nose is up off the ground? It's because the nose is rocking up off the ground. If I step on the nose, the board rolls around. There's a little bit of an incline to the ground here, but not so much. This one also has accentuated rocker on the tail, so this tail comes up off the ground. The flat zone that would be sitting flat on the water on this particular board is probably only this wide, and then the rocker starts. If I hold the board up, you can see how that nose tips up. That's the rocker. You might be able to see how the tail tips up slightly. Not as much so, but definitely tips up. What the rocker does is contributes to the maneuverability. Tail and nose won't dig into the water when we're turning. They rock out of it. So the board is very agile and moves easily. This is a super fun wave and chop board because it's not going to dig in, throw us off. It's going to maneuver easily, and because of the extra width in the middle, it's going to still feel stable. Pros of the planing board: super maneuverable. Feels extra stable compared to some of the narrower boards, like a displacement board like this one. Downsides are Because this nose is rounded up, if we're paddling into the wind is going to catch that nose and knock it off. So harder to paddle in a straight line, harder to paddle in the wind. I consider this board my fun board. This board wants to carve and I take it out on the waves and it's just a ton of fun. If I'm going to be paddling in a straight line all afternoon, this board is going to be a whole lot of extra work. So, planing board. The next hull type is displacement hull. This board in the middle is a displacement hull. Characteristics of a displacement hull: longer, this one's a 10.3, this one's a 12.6. Narrower in the middle, this is a little bit older model, it's 31 inches across the middle, so it's still kind of wide. These boards generally today are designed more around 28, 29 inches, so a fair bit more narrow in the middle. So they're longer, narrower in the middle, and pointier on the front. So you can see the shape of this nose here. Displacement hulls are designed to go straighter and faster, harder to maneuver. So planing, easy to maneuver, more stable, easier to get going on, straighter and faster, good in the wind, harder to turn, less maneuverable. The reason for that is that nose, they call them displacement hulls because this nose generally sits in the water and it displaces the water as it's pushing through it. This board's designed to plane over top. This board's designed like a kayak to push its way through it and part the water. Because the nose is in the water, it doesn't blow off in the wind. It's easier to go straight. Because the way the nose is designed, here I'll hold it up here, because of the way the nose is designed, you can see there's actually a ridge here that is like a mini keel that holds the water. So that helps it track straight. So we don't have to put a lot of effort into going straight. The board's going to do it automatically. All our effort can be going into propelling it faster. That, though, is going to make it harder to turn. When we're doing some of those big forward sweeps, we have to push that whole nose through the water. That's when we have to step on the tail, get the nose up with a bit of a pivot or a cross draw, and move it manually. So, one more time, planing hulls. Designed to plane over top of the water. Characteristics are rounded through the nose, a little bit wider in the middle. Very maneuverable. Great in chop, great in waves. Not great paddling into the wind. Nose always gets knocked off. Displacement hulls. Designed to go faster, straighter. This is called a touring board, this particular model. Touring board, we put gear on. I can put a whole bunch of tents, I can put sleeping bag on it, and I can go camping overnight because this board is designed to be easier to paddle for the distance, and they're also designed with more carrying capacity. Construction type. Hardboards. How hardboards are designed is it starts with a big chunk of styrofoam, and then it's shaped in whatever the shaper wants that board to do. So this board is shaped to be wide, rounded, with rocker. This board was shaped into being a displacement hull. That's pointy in the front, a little bit wider in the middle, and just longer overall. And then we wrap some sort of casing around it. Both of these are fiberglass. You can get carbon fiber. You can get composites, which are going to change the characteristics of the board in regards to weight and maybe a bit of glide, but mostly from a weight point of view. A board that's all fiberglass is generally going to be a little bit heavier. Carbon fiber just makes it lighter. This board here is an inflatable. Inflatable rolls up into a backpack. You can see by looking at it, it's shaped like a planing hull. But because it's an inflatable, it doesn't have a styrofoam core. Because it doesn't have a styrofoam core, when we deflate it, we roll it up, and it's easier to store. So because it's shaped like a planing hull, the characteristics are very similar. It's rounder on the front. It's easier to maneuver. It's going to get knocked off in the wind because of the rocker. So similar characteristics. Because it's an inflatable, as opposed to a hard board, it comes with a couple of other extra considerations. One of them on an inflatable is the thickness of a hard board. This board is 6 inches thick. A 6-inch inflatable has a lot of rail on the side. Disadvantage of that is when the wind comes up, It's going to be hard to paddle into the wind because it's a planing board style, but it's also going to be catch a lot of wind and blow around more because of that extra 6 inches on the board. So that extra thickness is going to make the board a little bit is going to make it harder to handle in the wind. The positive side of that extra thickness is we get extra stability, we get extra carrying capacity, and it's going to feel more rigid for a bigger rider. So 6 inches is quite often the default, but that most manufacturers use. I think because they have one type of fabric, they can make all sorts of different types of boards, and they're all 6 inches thick. Higher end brands, Kahuna has them, Starboard has them, Nash has them. They have different thicknesses available. So 6 inches would be the biggest one that you would put a large rider on, but they also would have a 4.5 or a 4.7 inch thickness, which is something that I would probably want to ride. It's thinner. The board doesn't need to have as much carrying capacity because I'm not 6'3", 6'4". I don't weigh over 200 pounds, so I don't need all that extra capacity. So I would personally take a board that was a little bit thinner, and it'll be a little bit more easier for me to maneuver. So inflatables. This one's shaped like a planing hull. You can also get them shaped like a displacement hull. So when they're cutting the fabric, it's the same as shaping the styrofoam. Depending on the intent and what they're designing and what they're creating will depend on how they cut it and how they glue it together. Inflatables are made with what's called drop stitch fabric. So where hardboards have styrofoam in the middle of them, drop stitch fabric is a whole series of threads that goes from the top to the bottom. So if we were to cut this in half, it would just be thousands of threads that we would see going from top to bottom. That's why we can put such high pressure in it without it turning into a beach ball. It stays flat and rigid. So that's the construction type, and that's the fabric that they use. Different qualities of fabric will also change price points on the board. So you'll get some boards that are going to be a much lower price point on Amazon. I've seen $200, $300, $400. A Starboard, a good quality board, you're probably looking at about $2,000. You're going to be getting quality, you're going to be getting better gluing, better taping, and a better construction material, and more research and design going into building the features that make that board a higher end board. Generally, the more you spend on an inflatable, the more features are built into it to make it behave more like a hardboard. On that note, what is the difference? On a hardboard, when I'm on that board and on the water and it's all wavy and I'm jumping up and down on that board, I feel like I'm jumping up and down on a dock. That board I just land on and it doesn't give. If I jump up and down on an inflatable, there's always a bit of movement in it. As the waves get bigger, that board is going to move a tiny bit, even if we put the 15 or 20 pounds in it that some boards can take. Even if we have that maximum pressure, inflatables always have a bit of movement, so they always feel like they're giving a little bit. So pros and cons of the two sizes. The biggest thing that makes an inflatable desirable to folks is easy transport, easy storage. In a big city where storage is a premium, you know, hardboards are really hard to store. Most people can't. Roll up an inflatable, put it in your closet, it's good to go. You can take it on transit, you can take it on the bus, you can take it on the SkyTrain, you can throw it in your trunk and carry it around with you. You know, it's going to be much easier to maneuver. So, main features of these boards, or main hull types: planing, displacement, shaped like a planing. Hardboard versus inflatable. Pros and cons: super easy to maneuver, easier to get going on, quite often a person's first board. Designed to go straight and fast, better for touring. Displacement boards are also, when they make them skinnier and longer, that's what race boards are made from, or that's the same hull type that race boards use. A race board might be 24 inches across the middle. A rider my size, or in that 5 to 5.5 foot range, is going to be on a 12-foot board, 14-foot board for anyone taller. So they're longer, skinnier, they're made with lighter materials, so they're lighter, and they are designed to do nothing but go fast with as much ease as possible. That's a variation on a displacement board. All right. Those are the key features. Oh, one more. Volume. Volume is a reference to literally the volume of the board. With a hardboard, it's the volume of the styrofoam after it's been shaped. You know, volume is measured in liters. So you might also think of it as if you take that board and push it under the water, however much water is displaced for it to go underneath, that's the volume of that board. It's the volume that it takes up in space. So all boards have a volume associated with them. The higher the volume, the greater the carrying capacity. A lot of boards now, to make them easier for people to purchase, they have, you know, maximum weight capacities, because that's what we think of. We think of pounds, we think of kilograms. So they might put pounds on maximum weight on a board. Maximum weight capacity on this board is probably like 380 pounds or maybe 300 pounds. It doesn't mean you can put someone who's 300 pounds on this board. It might mean you can carry a person, a dog, and a small child, but really when you're putting that much on it, it's going to be tippier anyway. So, and it's a rough estimate. Maximum weight capacity on this board is probably, you know, 250 pounds. But I guarantee you, if you put someone that heavy on the board, they're going to have a hard time paddling. I guess my point is, when a manufacturer puts weight capacity on the board, it's the maximum theoretical weight. I would generally take a portion off of it. For me, this board is good for somebody up to about 180, 190 pounds. Okay, so back to volume. Volume, what it means to us is, what's the carrying capacity? A board like this, depending on the features of the board, we start losing volume. A board like this isn't super thick. This one might be 3.5 to 4 inches thick. But because it's very rounded at the front and it's very wide at the back, we get a lot of volume from the sheer size of the board. So these boards don't have to be extra thick, which is good. Because when we're standing on a board, we don't want extra thick, because the higher up our center of gravity is off the surface of the water, they start feeling unstable. So we want a lot of volume without a lot of height. A displacement board, because they're pointy at the front, we start losing the benefit we get from all this rounding. So we're losing volume in the styrofoam. Quite often they're narrower at the back, so we start losing volume again. So how a displacement board gains more volume is they go higher. So this board is a little over 6 inches thick, and the nose might be higher even again. On a race board, it's not common to see a great big bulbous nose on the front of it, and that's to increase the volume, to increase the carrying capacity. So volume is a measure of what's the carrying capacity on the board. Now, as I just mentioned over here, a board that isn't as thick is good for our center of gravity. So what's the disadvantage? We start having the disadvantage on a displacement board if they start getting extra thick, because the center of gravity is coming up higher and they're starting to feel less stable. So what manufacturers do is, you see how it's higher at the front? It's quite a bit narrow or thick. It's not as thick at the tail. So by the time we get to the foot zone, it's not as thick here. They've also recessed this area, so it's a little bit lower than at the nose again, helping us lower our center of gravity. If you look at a race board will be high sides, high rails, big thick nose, and dug way out in the middle where the feet go to help us go lower. So they start designing the boards with stability in mind, because they know that we're losing the volume that we need. They are gaining it in certain places, but we still need to maintain stability on the board. So things that you might notice some boards have a very big dugout foot zone. That's to increase stability as the volume is increasing and making the board thicker. An inflatable has a very high volume. That's why this one has such a high carrying capacity, because it's 6 inches thick. And especially with the shape that looks more like a planing hull, we just get a lot of volume. But again, the downside of that is they can't have a lowered foot zone on an inflatable, so we're just higher. So 6 inches not only catches the wind as a disadvantage, it actually raises our center of gravity almost 6 inches off the surface of the water, because they don't submerge very much. So it's going to feel tippier because of that as well. And again, that would be another reason why personally I would ride, or prefer to ride, a 4.7, because everything's a little bit lower. All right, we talked about hull size or hull shape, construction types, pros and cons of the different types, and volume, and how that affects us when we're riding. All right, that's hardboards.